Go over a very important concept when dealing with network operations, and that's the idea of doing something in the background. Now, what that means is that when you're doing something currently, you have a single thread of code execution. It's just going one after the other. Sometimes what you want to have happen is the UI to still be responsive and process events as they come in, but then maybe in the background you want to get some data, like a network request. You don't want these things to coincide at the same time. You can't have them on the same thread. So doing things in the background allows us to do things concurrently at the same time. That can get really tricky trying to make sure we don't step on each other's toes. And so we're going to show you how to do that with something called an AsyncTask class. Now, normally if you wanted to do some network operations, you'd use libraries and make this stuff be 1 or 2 lines of code. But I think it's important that we go over kind of doing things the long way so that you guys know how to troubleshoot things on your own in the future. So we're going to start with the application. So as you can see, I'm clicking on this button and it's responding every time I click. And we've all been through here before where you start a process and notice the button is still responding. That's because in the foreground it's updating the UI and in the background it's actually downloading the image. Now I know that image looks very small, but it was actually pretty large, which is why it took so long. So now let's take a look at how to do that in code. So here I have a download class, download task, which extends AsyncTask. Now to understand that code, let's actually create a new async task just so you can see what all that stuff means. So we'll just call it my task, extends AsyncTask. Now you notice here that there are 3 different pieces, and they're very important. Params, or the very beginning part here, is the input. So if you're going to do a task in the background, this allows you to specify kind of what data type you want to stick in to this whole process. For instance, we're going to use a string because we want to start with like a URL. The next is the progress type. So this is where you would stick in the data type you'd want to communicate kind of what's going on. I'm going to use an integer because I actually want to express how much of my download is complete. And then finally, the clearest of the 3 pieces is the result. So the result itself is going to be, once we're done with this task, what do we then want to go back to the main UI with, and what is that data type? So just to show you this kind of auto-completing, because it does it pretty nicely for you. So I'm going to do an async task, and I'm going to use the same parameters: string, integer, bitmap. And I'm actually just pressing Apple N and doing override methods, and I'm going to just focus on the 3 most important ones, or 4 most important ones here. So you'll notice just right away that data types propagate through. That string relates to that string. This integer decision ends up being right here. This bitmap is right here on post execute. So it's really simple once you get your head around the fact that this is doing stuff for you. I mean, if I were to jump in here, you'd see there's a lot of stuff written for us. An async task basically handles the idea that you don't want to step on someone's toes when you're doing something in the background, and then when you communicate back to the foreground, it really can get into issues where you're not really sure what thing gets called at what time. So I'm going to just kind of simplify it for you so that you can use it. So on pre-execute is the first thing that gets executed. Whatever you run here is going to run on the main UI, and it's a really good time to maybe set some things up visually for the user about what you're going to do. Next is we're going to get this do in background. Everything that happens in this method happens on a whole nother thread in the background. It's really awesome. So rather than us having to figure out exactly how to manage all that, we get the data to come in here, and we're going to return whatever we're done with, and it's just that simple. Now the next part is kind of weird because this is 2A, but this one kind of also happens depending on what we do with 2B. Now this runs back on the main update thread, but only when in the background we run the method publish progress. So this is a way that as we're doing something in the background, we can actually say, hey, I'm 5%, I'm 10%, I'm 30% complete. Now we can't actually update the UI from the background. That's has to be done in the foreground. It's a foreground type of thing. So that allows us to communicate while we're looping through some data to actually publish our progress back over here and actually update the UI to say what percentage we might be complete. And then finally, this is again back on the foreground thread. we get to run our onPost execute. So works kind of like this: pre-execute, execute, sometimes we update, post execute. So that being said, now let's look at some code that's actually doing all the complexities. And I don't want you to focus on any one line. That's for you to kind of step through and figure out. I just want you to focus on the high-level things that are going on. So the most important part to know is that when you click that button, this is what executes right here: download task.execute. Now, we've created a new download class. We defined it. But notice that we're not calling any of the methods in download task that we just talked about. We're calling this execute method. That execute method handles a lot of stuff for us, and it's how you pass in data to an async task. In this case, we're actually passing in a string that was defined up above. So you're not going to be calling any of those methods yourself. It's going to do it for you behind the scenes, making things much easier for you. So in this case, we're going to execute this particular string. Well, that goes through a lot of different things. Finally, it comes out for the first time for us right up here in doing background. Now, before doing background runs, we said that pre-execute runs. Notice that he doesn't get a copy of any string. There's no parameter passed into him. This is, again, just like the setup for when we're about to do something in the background. Here, we're just setting some visual things to say, hey, make the text view say that it's going to do something and have the progress meter, show itself. And that's all we want to do with pre-execute. It just runs right after we're about to do something in the background. If we come up here, we finally see the string come in. I'm not sure if you've seen this before, but this is actually just saying that it's a string array, or it could be a single one, which is why we're going to reference it as params0. But this is the data type of a string array, the first item being what we passed in. So doing background is going to run, and we're going to take a file location, and this is all the kind of raw setting up a connection to the server bit by bit, and then while we're reading in the data bit by bit, you'll notice again, you see publish progress. Publish progress is just showing us how much of the data we have. It's going to be coming back over here to on progress update every time that that loops through and gets another chunk of data. Again, all of this is happening in the background, but the publish progress is actually going to on progress update in the foreground. So this method, this method, this method, these are all running in the foreground. It's only this one that's running in the background. And we don't really want to mess with the UI from the background. It's not a good idea. I'm not even sure if Android will let you. We want to do the things that we want to do concurrently in the background. When we're finally done here, you'll see that we actually have a method called decode file, because we're actually just taking all that data and throwing it to a file. And that's going to return, which is a bitmap type. And of course, that ends up going to onPost execute, which, as you can guess, is now going to show the actual bitmap that we took the time to download. So I really want you guys to focus not necessarily on these particular details of making a network connection. These are things that you're going to have to see over and over again. There's many different ways to do it. It all depends on the situation. But what's important is to understand how this async task works, and to understand how to move data from the foreground to the background and then back, and to not interrupt your UI. If you're able to do that successfully, and you're able to understand the problems that could go on while doing that, you're going to be able to make apps that are able to feel really responsive and do a lot of crazy stuff in the background, and ultimately make your users happy while having a very powerful app.